Okay, we're live. I'm here today with Robin, and welcome, Robin. It's a pleasure to have you.
Hey, Douglas. It's great to be here. This is fun.
Yeah, so we were just chatting before we got started here about back to work, and there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
So let's just get started. I love that you brought this up because it's very top of mind here for us as well. And so I guess you want to kick us off with just kind of what's kind of rattling around your head around this
Yeah.
like this challenge of back to work.
Well, a little over a year ago, we offices closed across the country, but across the globe, but we'll focus here in the U.S. Closed across the country, right? Without at the time a real plan around what that was going to look like, right? If you remember, a year ago this time, we were really taking it day by day, week by week in a lot of regions, and depending on where in the country you were. And as the vaccines are rolling out across the country, a lot of places are starting the conversation now around, okay, well, what does that mean to us around bringing people back into office spaces? And I was having a conversation with a client yesterday, and they said, the thing for us that we really have to grapple with is we have some people that cannot wait to get back in the office, and we have other people who are terrified of it. Right. And I think that's part of what we're going to have to deal with is how do we support people to go back into the office? And then how do we work that way? Because we may have more than ever before a truly hybrid work experience where you have people still working in this office and you have people back in sort of together in office spaces across the country. And I'm interested to see what do we all need to learn to get better at being able to do that?
Yeah, you hit on a really important thread there because I think there's a lot of dynamics at play around how ready people are to go back. And, I think some folks have kind of settled into this new way. I think others have potentially just accepted it, but haven't really fully grappled with like all the emotions of having to
Mhm.
go through this year. And I think, we talked about transitions and how hard they are. I think that moments of that's going to create a lot of emotion around just kind of even considering going back and what are my new norms, what are my new habits that I'm going to have to think about, like wait, taking the kids and dropping them off, or like, what is my ritual on the way to work, like all that stuff's going to be, it's like it's all going to be new, and it's going to bring up a lot of baggage, I think.
Well, there's a couple of things that come to mind for me about that I think are potentially lessons learned over the last year. So my organization, I think other organizations, like I said, we sort of moved into this like a little at a time. I don't think we were explicit about what were the new norms around working virtually. We lived our way into them. We fumbled through them in a lot of places, right around, well, does your organization expect you to be on camera? Does yours not expect you to be on camera when you're on video calls? What's sort of the norms around attire, right? Like, what's the norms around how people greet each other and leave? When we're in a room together, we know what all those norms are. We know what to expect. And so over the last year, we've stumbled and fumbled our way through that. We're going to have to do that again. And so, like, what did we learn by stumbling last year that we can apply now? And I think some of it's going to be, how do we be more explicit about what the expectations are as leaders? What are we expecting? Are we expecting people to be back in full time? Are we expecting people to be part? And if it's part time, what does that actually mean? Because what I think of as being part-time in office might be very different than what you think of it as. And what I think is essential might be to be present for together. Somebody else might have a totally different perception of, which could lead to a lot of breakdowns in the system. And so I think there's going to be a lot of like, how do we reestablish what the new norms are going to be? Because I don't think just going back, quote unquote, is actually realistic. I don't think that's what it's going to look like.
Yeah, lots of folks close down their offices, especially small businesses. It's
Right.
like, why renew the lease? And for me, I had an office downtown that I was set to renew last, let's see, the middle of last April. And so, like, going back to me means, am I going to one of the accelerators that I mentor at? Because I've got a hot desk there I can kind of hop into. Like, I'm not even sure. I had to sit down and figure that out, right? It's not a matter of just getting in the car and going somewhere. and repeating some behaviors I've done in the past, it's like it takes some mental faculties to even think through what does it look like? How do I even want to show up?
Well, and it really is like, how do you use the space and how people use the space as an accelerator of your of whatever the culture is, and not as a default. And I think space is really interesting. I've noticed over the course of the last year, as people have had to make choices like the ones you just said around, do we keep space, not keep space? For some people, they have a real deep personal attachment. I know of 2 CEOs off the top of my head that have deep attachment to the space. They're very proud of it. It represents who they think the company is. They think it represents the company culture. So the notion of not having people back in the space together is not just a practical one around collaboration, although that's on their minds. It's also about this pride they have about the location. But not everybody in the organization may share that, right? And so like you can't run over that because that really is important to some people. But how do you balance that with other people, like you said, have the utility of being at home means I don't have to rush or drive 3 hours to the office, right? I have another client that I've talked to out of Chicago who said, like, not sitting in rush hour traffic for an hour and a half in each direction, I get 3 hours back in my day. That matters to me personally, right? And so this is going to be sort of the dance we have to do of how do we balance all of the things that people really care about and the things they're all really worried about as we move back into what is going to look like a real hybrid experience for people, I think.
Yeah, I think there are tons of people that are eager to go back. There are tons of folks that are like eager but like cautious, cautiously optimistic because they're wanting to navigate it safely, but not everyone has great conditions at home. Like some people are still working from the kitchen table, and so
That's right.
like they're kind of ready to be able to spread out. And even I have like an adequate space, and I dream of more flexibility. Like my cameras are kind of in the corner, and I'm like, well, it'd be nice if these were on wheels, and I had a bigger kind of studio that I could rearrange, because I feel like it gets a little mundane with everyone seeing the same angle all the time, right? And,
well, I think for leaders, this is really going to take an attention to folks, and there are so many individual factors that go into the personal preferences that people have. And before, if we go back to the notion of cultural norms, it was just the norm that everybody was going to be at the office, right? Like maybe in some places they had a little bit of like you have a day a week or 2 days a week, but that really was the norm. The expectation was you were going to be in the office for the most part. And it was easy for people to say that was just the default. Like they didn't have to give an explanation for why. That just was the default. Whereas now, like that's not necessarily the default, right? And so how do people really get comfortable with there could be some other alternatives, and how do we navigate that together as a community? Because I know for us, in some ways, so consulting firms spread out all over the country, we've actually been closer in the last year because we've had a lot of opportunities to be together. So for us, a big part of this is going to be figuring out, how do we maintain that? Because we've actually found that there's lots of ways for us to be connected and collaborate differently than we had in the last year that we don't want to lose now as we go back into travel and airplanes and office, being in the office.
100%. As you were speaking, it reminded me of one of the questions that we brought up during the pre-show chat, and this idea of what are folks planning to do to support people that are still at home? Because to your point, there are some people that are, maybe we've hired people in different cities now. That we've been home for a year. I guarantee you, I know so many people that have done that. And so what does it look like to support folks that are both at home and in the office, and even folks that are in the same city aren't going to be comfortable, won't be able to drive across town anymore because they're now supporting a different lifestyle of some sort, and it could even be caring for loved ones or whatever other commitments have surfaced up that they need to handle. And I think that's where we get into a lot of these complex challenges that leaders are going to need to solve for.
Well, and at a really tactical, practical level, for those of us who lead meetings on a regular basis, all in one room or all on virtual, we've kind of learned a lot of the tips around how to make that work. Now you're going to have a little bit of both, right? And so I think that's going to take a whole different level of thoughtfulness around how do you connect people so that people can make the contribution that they long to make. It's really easy for, if you have people in a room, to suddenly not include the folks that are there virtually. And if we are going to allow for the diversity of people being able to have some say in where they're sitting at any given moment, we also have to figure out how to include them in those conversations so that they can make a meaningful contribution. So that level of connection and really being thoughtful about how to do that is going to take a different kind of meeting planning, I think, for folks, and a different kind of leadership in those meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that two things to think about there. One is leaders need to anticipate that, because the real problem is when you just assume that it's all going to work itself out, and then you just kind of default to some norms. That's where you're going to get into trouble. And the other thing I'll say, apart from just bringing intention and thinking about it, is that everyone's going to be have so many different needs. The other thing to keep in mind is that, and this comes from a thread I was reading from a group of facilitators on LinkedIn, and the overwhelming consensus from very, very masterful facilitators was that there is no such thing as hybrid. Because if you really want to create a truly inclusive environment and someone's remote, then everyone has to use the remote tools.
Yep.
So even if we're physically in a hybrid state where you've got folks that are in the room together and folks that are remote, if the folks in the room aren't using that tool via the same bandwidth that the person remotely is using, then the person remotely is going to have, or that's remote, is going to have a subpar experience. Unless you're designing kind of breakouts and moments that kind of embellish each component. But I think they're being a little bit facetious in the sense that, like, if someone's remote, then we're doing a remote session. Like, we have to use the remote tools, or else they're going to have a deficient experience.
That's been our lived experience over the course of the last year. We do work around the world, and so we had a few locations when we had been doing work in the last year with one client in particular, where they would have people in a room together, and oh my God, very hard to facilitate. To your point, like, the only way to make it work is the people in that room form their own breakout, right? And so you can make that work, but people do not have the exact same experience in that, right? So if you really do want to create an experience where everyone has something to contribute, everybody has to have a similar platform with which to do that. And when you've got people in a room and people remote, it's really challenging to be able to have the people that are remote get their voice into the conversation, no matter how loud they are or how persistent. Yeah. At least as the technology exists today, right? So yeah. I am confident that there's somebody out there working on this right now to figure out how do we do this in a different way than we have even thought about today. And a year from now, you and I will have a different conversation about that.
I agree. I think we're going to see a lot of motion through, or just kind of evolution through experimentation, and software will certainly play a role there. And the thing that really jumped out to me when you were talking was this. Just like when the pandemic first hit, I think there was this issue, and I still see it today, but it's not quite as pervasive, where people will just use the software and just assume the software will show them how to run a good session. And the thing is like, you got to design a good session and then make the software work for your design. And I think the same thing is true for hybrid. We have to design with intention. What is the experience we want to create? And then use then consider the fact that, okay, where are they at and how are they gonna mix? Because if we're just letting the fact that these 5 people happen to be in the office together dictate that they're in the breakout together, that may be okay, depending on what we're trying to accomplish. Are those all the leaders? Are those the ones thinking strategically, and the remote people happen to be thinking tactically? Then maybe that works out, right? Because that separation of conversation is okay. But if that's not part of our design and it doesn't like align with our desired outcomes, then we can't really just default to it just because they happen to be together and these people happen to be separate, you know?
Absolutely. I know we're going to bump in time. My colleague, Cal Delaney, loves to say that, like, yes, Zoom fatigue is real, but a big part of it is because our meetings are designed so poorly. And that actually, it was true when we were in the room together as well, right? Like the meetings were designed poorly then. It's just that we feel it so much more now that we're here all day long. So there is something about really paying attention to what's the look and feel? How do you want people experiencing this conversation? And what are you trying to accomplish? In some cases, that virtual hybrid will work. To your point, like if the people all in the room together are the right ones to be in that conversation, great. I just think we're going to have to put a lot more thought into how to make that structure work for the outcomes we're driving for.
You're so spot on. So many people come to us and say, can you teach us how to run virtual meetings? And the thing I always tell them is, well, we can show you some tips and we can show you how to use tools, but let's just talk about good meeting design because you were just accustomed to bad meetings. It's because that was the status quo. And the virtual is just shining a spotlight on how
bad all of our meetings are. They really are.
On that note, that's a great place to end. And thanks a bunch for chatting today, Robin. It was a pleasure, and we'll have to do it again.
So fun. Thanks for having me. I hope to be back soon.